Hey guys, Buildzoid here, and today we're going to be talking about the VRM thermals on the ASUS X470-Pro motherboard. So here's the board. I have taken off the Vrm Heatsink on this because we'll be taking a closer look at that later. And the VRM on here is a 6-phase. It uses International Rectifier 3553 power stages. Those are 40 amp power stages. And it's actually a VRM that you would find there's a few GPUs out there that actually use a very similar 6-phase with International Rectifier 3553s in them. For example, Sapphire has the R9390 Nitro from Sapphire uses a very similar VRM to this. That's like a 200 amp output graphics card at stock. Then there's the like the RX480 Nitro, the RX580 Nitro, LE edition, I think. So yeah, there's a lot of GPUs using a very similar VRM to this, and those do fine. So you would expect this to do just fine as well, right? In terms of VRM thermals, because a 2700X, even at 1.4 volts, pulls a lot less power than something like an R9390. This heatsink is kind of a problem, though. Like that is not much of a heatsink. So before we get into the details of the actual thermal results, let's go over what I tested it in. So this is the case I was testing in. It's, I think, a Corsair Carbide 400C. The cooling system for the CPU is an NZXT Kraken X62. And the radiator is mounted as intake, so I did monitor intake air temperature and exhaust air temperature just to make sure that, you know, the CPU wasn't like, because if like the intake air was 25°C and the exhaust was like 50, then the whole radiator up front is massively harming VRM thermals. But if the intake air temperature, which is what I monitored those, so you'll see them in the results. But basically, if the exhaust air temperature wasn't massively above intake, then it's not real. Like, this is a good way to run the cooling system. The GPU in there is an R9 Fury that was just completely run at stock across all testing, and it was idle for the CPU tests. And what else is there? Right, the exhaust situation is there's a 120 and a 140 millimeter for exhaust. They both ran max RPM the entire time because they really don't go that fast and they're not that loud. So yeah, those were maxed out the entire time. The CPU so the fans for the AIO were actually motherboard sets, like the motherboard PWM controlled. So they still did ramp up all the way to max under Prime 95 because that runs really hot on the CPU. So ultimately so basically all the CPU tests were done with the same intake fan speed. So yeah, and that pretty much covers it, I think. So, well, the logic, well, I'll explain some of the logic behind. Well, there's not that much logic to it, but basically the reason why I have the radiator as intake is because that's the best way to get the best CPU temperatures. If you want your CPU to not get cooked by your GPU, you run your radiator as intake, because if you run your radiator as exhaust and then you run your GPU, then you'll notice that the GPU actually makes a huge difference to internal case temperature. Like, compared to the CPU, the GPU just absolutely, like, the air temperature from a GPU is just awful, like absolutely awful. Like, GPUs easily end up with spitting out air that is like 40+C, easy. So if you have your radiator as exhaust, your radiator is suddenly being fed with air that's like 35-40C. If you had something really, really hot, you might be looking at even 50C, and then it's just like, well, your CPU is going to cook with that kind of air going through the radiator. So that's why the radiator is used as intake, because that's the best setup for CPU temperatures. And I'd honestly recommend that if you don't have unless you have a very good reason to not run your radiator as intake, run the radiator as intake. Because, well, good reasons to not run radiator as intake would be things like your GPU has a god-awful air cooler, which, if you have like a reference card, is always true. But assuming you have a GPU with a good cooling system and your motherboard has a proper VRM, this is the best way to cool the CPU. So that's the test scenario I'm going with, because it's just like, this is what you should run. Not like, yeah, this is what I would recommend you always run, because any other setup is just less than ideal for for CPU temperatures. So that's the inside of the case. Now for temperature monitoring, I had a K-type thermocouple just stuck to the back of the board with some sticky thermal pad. It does look a bit like chewing gum, but no, that is thermal pad. And it is sticky, so that just held the thermocouple in place. The K-type thermocouple was crammed right against the leg of a choke, and the reason why I was using, and this is the phase side of the choke, so the side where the actual MOSFET is. And the reason why I'm cramming it up against the leg of a choke is because that's like a metal, basically an all-metal connection all the way to the actual MOSFET itself, so it's really good for sort of thermal conduction in that sense. And so, yeah, that's how I was monitoring Vrm temperatures. It might have arguably gotten higher temperatures if I moved it a phase up, or, you know, I'm not sure that that was definitely the hottest phase. That's roughly the middle of the vCore VRM, and in theory, that should be the hottest part. So, though, you know, like the SoC VRM is also sort of to the left of it, above it to the left, and arguably that might have been like going closer to the SoC VRM might have gotten a bit warmer, or maybe probably a bit warmer, but either way, this is just the measuring thing is, I don't have like an IR gun, so it's not exactly easy to check which spot would be the best to measure off of. But anyway, that's where I did measure, and honestly, if there was a place on the VRM that was hotter, that would be really bad for this motherboard. Like, that would, like, this was already hot enough. Like, and honestly, I did get the motherboard to shut down, and the shutdown temperature for most motherboard VRMs is around 125. So, and I measured 118. So I think that worst case scenario, I was off by 7 degrees, right? I might have been measuring like 7 degrees lower than what I would ideally you would have wanted to. So yeah, I'm not exactly like, I'm gonna say that's fine. It's not ideal, but it's fine. It works well enough for the for my testing purposes here. And the other thing to note is that I did not run the back panel on the case, and that arguably makes the VRM temperatures lower as well, because hot air rises, and to be completely honest, the airflow that is going in front of the motherboard does not leak behind it at all. Like that, the only air you could feel moving was like if you put your hand above where the VRM was, you could feel the hot air from the back of the board basically rise up from the VRM. That was it. So if you had the back panel on, that would all get just trapped behind the motherboard, and arguably the VRM would end up running hotter. I'm not sure how much. I might have to get around to testing that. So yeah, but work in progress. This is the first time I'm doing VRM thermal testing, and eventually it'll work. You know, eventually I'll have a methodology that works perfectly. And yeah, but for now I think this is, it's rough around the edges, but it's good enough, I think. So that's the test methodology, and here's the results. And you may notice that the motherboard did suddenly shut down, and it did hit 118 degrees. That was under prime 95, so yeah. And as you can also see, throughout testing, the exhaust air temperature really wasn't that hot until I did the Firestrike combined test. So for prime 90.5 small FFTs, that's with AVX acceleration. The VRM temperature is like 1.3 volts, I'm going to say is acceptable. 1.4 volts are getting concerning, but the problem is with with Ryzen 2000 running 1.4 volts on these CPUs is really less than ideal, because they do get really hot under AVX workloads. As you can clearly see, the CPU is hitting almost 80 C. And that's with 25 C air going into the radiator. So it's not like it's not like my ambient's super high. I have a friend who lives in Italy. His summer is 35 degrees to 40. So actually I have two friends who live in Italy, and they complain a lot every summer about how they're getting cooked alive. So this motherboard should be pretty happy that I tested it at 25 and not like, ridiculous high ambient. But basically, so 1.3 volts, it's doing okay. It's not, 92 is, it's acceptable. I'd argue that it could do, if you had a real heatsink instead of a fashion accessory, that right there would be doing better, a lot better, arguably. But 92 at 1.3 volts, that's acceptable. Basically, if you're running a 2600X, your VRM temperatures will be actually even lower than that, because the 2700X at 1.3 volts should pull more power than a 2600X than at 1.4. So basically, if you have a 2600X, this motherboard should have no issues whatsoever. If you're going for a 2700X, it's kind of depends on your ambient air temperature, really. Yeah, but here it was doing okay-ish, so 92. Then if you crank up the switching frequency of the VRM to 600 kilohertz, it was doing 99, which I'd still like, because that wasn't the capacitors, I'd still consider that acceptable. 1.4 volts for a 2700X, I'm going to say, is not a voltage you would actually want to run daily. I would honestly max out around 1.35, 1.37-ish. The reason why I would max out around there is because past that, your power, if it, like the power, well, already at 1.35, the power consumption is just really high. But at 1.4 volts, it is insane. The CPU easily hits like 104, hits way more power consumption than like a R7 1700. In fact, I did a check that my CPU temperatures weren't anomalous, because they did seem kind of high for 1.4 volts, and I had to set the, using the Crosshair 7 Hero, I had to set the 1700 all the way to like 1.45 volts before I got the same kind of current reading as the 2700X. So basically, yeah, the 2700X just runs hotter than like the 1700s or the 1800Xs. It just runs more power for a given voltage. So I really wouldn't run these chips all the way at 1.4 for all core, because they just run really, really, really hot. So yeah, that kind of sucks. But the VRM temperatures in those tests were admittedly at 600 kilohertz, the motherboard did straight up thermally over temperature shutdown, but I wouldn't really consider that a catastrophe, because, well, first of all, I've not yet tested if running the switching frequency at 600 kilohertz actually makes an improvement in your overclocking range on the board. It might, and if it does, then that's actually a problem. If it doesn't, then it's not a problem, because you wouldn't be running that setting anyway, as it's just wasting VRM power. I did get the board to shut down, and it wasn't like the ambient was super high. Now, for Firestrike, the temperatures were fine. I mean, what did you expect? The CPU isn't really doing that much work. It did get reasonably warm at 60 C, but still lower than the 1.3 volt test. So, and that's Firestrike combined. So the CPU was doing close to 50% load on all cores. So it wasn't like it was idling. Like the CPU wasn't idling like if you were doing a GPU, just a pure GPU workload. So, yeah. Honestly, it's just the VRM temperatures for the tests I ran, they look high, and they are high, but ultimately I wouldn't say they're disastrous. You could reasonably survive with this on the motherboard. You could get away with running this. The thing is, if you live in a warm climate, and you do a lot of video rendering or Blender rendering or anything that uses AVX acceleration that gets as hot or close to as hot as a Prime 95, this board might have some VRM thermal issues. Or if you have worse case airflow than what I tested with, then again you might have VRM thermal issues. Oops. But if you're just gaming on the motherboard, you won't have any issues. It's just, if you're doing a stress test to see if your overclock is stable, the board might randomly shut down on you, and it's because the VRM overheats. So basically, while you're stress testing, you'll have to do something about the the VRM cooling, just for the period of time that you're doing your stress testing for. And then after you're done stress testing, you can just, I don't know, you can remove that, and you just have to hope that you don't run into any workload that, the other thing is there's time. You need to consider time, because the VRM does take, for the 1.3 volt test, I had to, that was the first test I ran, and after that the VRM was already hot, and it doesn't really cool down that quickly, so, but that first test I ran, when I started the computer and just you know, had it idling for a bit, and then when I ran Prime 95, it took like 45 minutes before it got to 92. So basically, for the VRM thermals to be a problem is you need to have a heavy workload that runs non-stop for like half an hour for the VRM to hit those kinds of temperatures, unless you have an extremely high ambient. So yeah, it's you know, you can definitely live with this. It won't catch, it won't do this, but I'm still gonna say this heatsink leaves a lot to be desired, because like this is not a bad VRM. As I said, it's been used on like freaking 390s. Like R9 390s come with this VRM, and those are fine. So the thing is, this board could definitely could definitely have better VRM temperatures if, you know, it wasn't so badly designed. And the thing is, so the VRM heatsink, you know, you have this, like, there's really not that much surface area. But the thing is, when you actually have it on the board, right, like a good chunk of that surface area is just like there, like in this gap, right, over the 8-pin. And realistically, there's no airflow getting down there. Like, there's just no way there's any airflow getting into that area of the board. The I/O cover definitely doesn't help that. That's just a great big piece of plastic acting as a big airflow block as well. So honestly, it's just like this VRM heatsink is just it's underwhelming. It's really underwhelming, because this motherboard, like the VRM on here, as far as the components go, they're fine. Like the components are perfectly good, but this heatsink is just awful. So yeah, that's basically my judgment on that. There's not really much else to say to it. It's not like this board will give you, if you're a gamer, you don't really need to worry about this. Stress testing might be a bit of an adventure, as the board might shut down on you. If you do video encoding or any kind of rendering, you might want to reconsider this motherboard for something that actually has proper VRM cooling. And another thing I want to point out is that, well, this board is the next one I'm testing for VRM thermals, and I have a sneaking suspicion this will do better, because this actually has heat sinks, and it's not that much, like, as far as the VRM efficiency goes, this is slightly worse. This is definitely slightly less efficient, but this actually has heat sinks that sink heat, whereas this is art. So, and the thing is, that board that I just picked up, that MSI Gaming Plus, that thing is a lot cheaper than this one. So yeah, it just, like, I really don't know what the hell, like, what this board is supposed to be sort of targeting, because it's like the VRM cooling is no, like, you know, it's not a disaster, but it isn't good. So, you know, it's just like barely acceptable. And then as far as features go, this board is even, like, I don't like this board as far as features go. It doesn't have that many. So yeah, I really just, yeah. I mean, I don't know. We'll see if, because I do have some other testing planned for it. We'll see if it redeems itself there, but I really doubt it, because, I mean, like, I'm pretty sure the other boards will just do as good or better on basically everything this board does, and they're definitely, like, there's several boards that are just straight up cheaper than this one. So yeah, but again, if for some reason you absolutely must buy this motherboard, it's probably not going to give you any issues, unless you live in like Italy or something, or a desert. That'll also be bad. Yeah, that's kind of that. And if you're on a 2600X, then knock yourself out. It won't give you any issues at all. But if you're on a 2700X, then yeah, it might have some problems. Though I will point out that if you just do, like, if you have a 2700X, you probably shouldn't be manually overclocking anyway, which I mentioned before. You should just crank up the performance boost override and not touch anything. Like, that's the easiest way to do it. Just like, that gives you very easy performance. It, you know, it does decently on the thermals. It doesn't go to 1.4 volts at all core load. It doesn't really also clock that high, but it works well enough. So, yeah. Basically, I might be a little bit too harsh on this board because I'm looking at it first. And we'll see how the other boards do, but for now, well, like, I'm just gonna say underwhelming, but acceptable, you know? Very, very, like, unimpressive, moderately concerning, but it's acceptable. Like, you could definitely get away with this as far as a motherboard goes, but it does leave the question about, like, you know, ASUS makes a board on X470, that's one step down from this. And if this is unimpressive, then the thing that's one step down from this has to be a freaking disaster. Because, well, I mean, I already mentioned that in the motherboard, some thoughts on X470 motherboard video, where I'm like, does the 4-phase ASUS X470 tough board, like, that thing has to be so bad. Because, like, this is actually a decent VRM, and it's still not doing that great. And that just looks like, yeah, so that's going to be a catastrophe. Now I want to test that board because I'll be like, oh, look, it does 130 at 1.3 volts or whatever. So, yeah, that's it for the video. Thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave comments, questions, suggestions, because I do actually need them, you know. These videos are very much work in progress for VR testing. So yeah, questions, comments, suggestions, leave them down below. If you'd like to support what I do here with actually hardcore overclocking, then I have a Patreon, a PayPal. There's also t-shirts you can buy like this one, which I do believe is still currently Europe exclusive, so I need to get around to making it available in America. I mean the US. I mean, no, America, because Canadians could also order it. So, anyway. Where was I going? Right, and basically that helps fund things like the testing of this motherboard, because this motherboard was bought with, like, I paid for this motherboard. It's not a review sample, which is why I can tell you that it's really kind of unimpressive. So yeah, that's it for the video. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.